All right. So, hi everyone. I'm Professor Moffett, and I teach creative writing here at USI. But I also, before I was this position, I was at an independent high school in Athens, Georgia, and I was the writing center coordinator there. So I worked mostly with high school students and sometimes with middle school students, and I taught the creative writing class also. So part of my thought behind this presentation is to give you some resources and to give you a place to start when you start thinking about like, how am I going to take creative writing into my classroom? And I teach poetry here at USI. So you may notice that some of the resources skew a little heavy on the poetry side. Casey pictures here to maybe give you some more on the fiction side if you need it. But I think that when I get students, undergraduates, a lot of them are like, I got nothing about poetry in my education so far. So maybe it's worthwhile that you have a little extra on that side. So I'm going to share my screen and do a little presentation. I will actually at this moment share the link with you so that you have it and you can come back to it and see the resources that I have there. I'll share it in the chat. And you should all be able to access that, but if you can't, let me know. And I'll go ahead and start the presentation. Let's see. All right. I think this is the best way to do it. Can you all see? All right. And hopefully when I do it this way, you won't be able to see my notes because that's embarrassing. Let's see. All right, can you just see the presentation still? Or is there like a little box that says press record on the left?
Yeah, I got it.
Which one?
There's not a box it says Rosalie Moffett has started sharing screen, but it's just a black screen, so.
Oh, it's just a black screen?
Yes.
Oh, that's not good. Hold on, let me try again. Might have to do it without. Let's do this. How about that?
That works.
All right, cool. Okay. So the title is They Want It, They Need It, They Have to Have It. And I made that the title because my experience in high school, teaching high school, is that there is a big portion of students who are really enthusiastic about creative writing, even the ones who are secretly not, like they're too cool for it or they're scared about it. And then the need it and have to have it part is has to do with kind of like the skills that it builds that are sort of applicable in other areas of your writing curriculum that creative writing helps with. And I wanted to start just initially with a few kind of reasons why teachers are hesitant to undertake teaching creative writing in high school. And a big one is that creative writing cannot be objectively assessed. So if you don't know how to assess it, how to grade it, that might give you pause. Another one is that, like, well, if you're not grading it, you don't have the kind of like motivation that comes with giving grades or failing students or giving A's. And you have this idea that like, well, writing has to be linked to an assessment. So now I don't know what to do. Thirdly, this idea that, well, there are more important things to teach first. So like, if they don't know how to write a perfect sentence, like we got to establish that before we can go on to anything else creative, which is more like icing on the cake. Fourthly, if you haven't taken a creative writing class, you might feel like you're not an expert and you don't know what to do and you don't know how to teach it. And that can stop you from sort of incorporating a full creative writing unit. And the next one is kind of like the first one, which is that like creative writing requires quote unquote talent. You can't teach talent. So but you can teach a 5-paragraph essay. So why don't we lean towards the things that you can teach? And then lastly, that creative writing is less important than essay writing. Do any of these things kind of ring true for you guys? Are these concerns that you have? A few. So we're kind of going to address some of them in this presentation. And one of the things, I'll go next to this sort of like text heavy slide, which again is there so that you can come back to it. But I think there's a lot of different ways that it's important to consider the role that creative writing can play in the kind of like wider English language arts writing curriculum. And this is adapted from, you can see at the bottom, teaching writing in secondary English, some of these points. And that's like a nice long resource in terms of like, if you need to develop a rationale to pitch your curriculum or your unit to administration or to, for yourself. So firstly, creative writing achieves the goals of the communicative act of shaping and conveying ideas for a particular purpose and audience, whether it to be inform, entertain, persuade, instruct, reflect, argue, inspire, or console. And so you can see there that kind of like the purposes that we think of when we assign other kinds of writing also apply to creative writing. Like you can think about, well, assigning a story that's there to instruct the reader, or a poem that's there to inspire the reader. These are kind of goals that work in the creative writing context as well. And secondly, through using language to compose their own stories and respond to those of others, students find a unique space in English classrooms to learn, grow, make meaning, and deepen their understanding of the self and others, an opportunity scarcely available nor legitimized in other curriculum subjects. So in this instance, you have like just a really good opportunity to kind of build these other kinds of skills of thinking about empathy, thinking about the self, thinking about others that you don't quite get elsewhere. And then lastly, for some students, the perception of writing as a personally rewarding and meaningful endeavor can be steadily eroded when they struggle with the staple forms and modes of academic written communication as they progress through secondary school. And this is something that, again, I would see as an opportunity. Like you have all different kinds of students in your classes, and some of them are going to really respond to the creative writing side of things. And it's a chance to kind of build engagement and build investment for the kind of student that might be sort of pulling away or pulling back. Especially like, and would have been true of me, like if we only did one kind of writing in my education experience, I would have probably never really engaged with it. So that's another way, is to use it as an opportunity. And then this is kind of just like along the lines of justification as well. But where will we be as a nation if we graduate a generation of young people who can write an academic paper on the Civil War, but have no power to convey the human experience? And that's just like one of the tools that you build with creative writing, is like these other modes and abilities to persuade and create and reach an audience that is important. So that's also, I have the article here that quote is pulled from, that if you'd like to read it, you can. So there's a lot of reasons to teach creative writing, I think. But if you're like, where do I start? Here's a nice little slide for you. And these for each 4 basic concepts that you can use to structure assignments, that you can use to structure units, that you can kind of take when you read with your students, looking at for fiction, character, plot, setting, and theme, and for poetry, image, metaphor, sound, and form. So these are, if you're like, I never got taught much about creative writing, I don't know, like this is a really simple place to start with your students, and also with your own sort of like thinking about structure of writing. And if at any point anyone has a question, just like obviously throw up a hand or whatever. If you want me to stop and talk more, I totally can. Okay, so when I was like, oh, I have to do this presentation, I reached out on Twitter to other writers that I know who teach high school, and to get their advice. And my advice, my like little side note advice is follow other teachers on Twitter. If you're on there, follow other, if you're gonna do a unit on poetry, follow poets. Like there's always going to be like stuff being posted all the time. It's a great resource. You should probably have a very professional presence on Twitter, but that's a whole other lesson for a different day. But I asked, what do you suggest I talk to these teaching students about? So my friend Megan says, bring in physical books of poems for them to see. Most of them have only experienced poems online or in textbooks. I like to bring a lot of books and give them a full period to read and explore and see what grabs them and what doesn't. And she teaches at a public school in New York City. So again, this is like my effort to give you like, where do I start? What do I start with? A great place to start in terms of that is with your librarian. And when I was teaching, I would spend some of my day in the library because that's where I conference with students. And our librarian was always pulling stacks of books for different classes. Like the sixth graders were doing mythology. So she would have like this whole big stack of like graphic novels and different kinds of books that the teacher could use as part of that unit. It's a great resource. Don't forget about your librarian. You can also use a public school or a public librarian as well, just to pull you a stack of contemporary books and anthologies appropriate to your grade level. Because I know that that's can be a challenge, especially for middle school, to find reading that's appropriate for middle schoolers. With high school, you have a little more range, but your librarian should also be able to help you. I also have here a list of diverse anthologies, one of which is Poetry 180, which is a curation by Billy Collins of poems that should pretty much all be able to be used in the classroom. 18 inclusive anthologies that highlight underrepresented voices, a list of anthologies, and then this particular anthology that's just, like I said, for middle schoolers, because they're a little bit tougher. And if you're like inclusive and diverse, and why is that there? And that's because one of the things that I hope that you'll do as teachers is to teach pieces and give them models that reflect their lives, right? So what you're getting when you get diverse and inclusive anthologies is often actually contemporary anthologies. So works being written relatively recently. And that's probably where you'll find poems that kind of have topics and subject matter that your students will recognize, which is something that helps them kind of enter and get started as well. Okay. So here are a few things that I have taught that I know others have taught. So, and I just wanted to show you, I think that, oops. For instance, The Fish by Elizabeth Bishop is one I've taught with younger students. And I bring this up because there are various sites that are really useful. Poets.org is a good one. This is one where the poem is composed broadly of like metaphors. There are all kinds of image and metaphors in this poem. And so one of the assignments I did with my students for that, with my younger students, was have them listen to the poem and draw what they saw, to get them into this like space of description, and to start to see how many things are in this poem that's ostensibly describing a fish, but really is doing so much else with its description. So that's one example of a resource. Oh no, there we go. And then to show you a different resource that's here, the Poetry Foundation is like a gold mine for educators. There's this whole list of resources, lessons, glossary of terms, things like that, poetry out loud, which I'll talk about later as part of this. So that's just something to know about and have, look at when you're trying to figure out, well, what am I going to bring into my classroom? This is a good, actually, if you look at this Gwendolyn Brooks poem, it's very short. You may not have seen it before, but it's sponsored all of these forms of poetry. So if you'll notice, we real cool, we left school, we lurk late, we strike straight, we sing sin, etc. This contemporary Terence Hayes poems, the end of each line ends with the words of the Gwendolyn Brooks poem. So it's called a golden shovel form. So to go back to the presentation. I give you this as some examples of both resources and like ways that you can kind of structure your own assignments for students. Like if you want to have them write a very similar kind of thing where you're like, oh, use these words at the end of the lines, look at these poems, see how it's done. You can use that as, I have this really squirrely mess. You can use that as an example. So I won't go through all of the examples I have here, but each of these examples has a good assignment that you can kind of see associated with it, or a good writing prompt that you can see associated with it. I also think that for creative writing, the more kind of like dynamic and multimedia you can make it it's like a really good opportunity because it really lends itself to that. And this is a suggestion from my friend Keith, who teaches in Ohio at a high school, and has this great video of Adrian Matika reading a Yusuf Komunyakaa poem. And
my name is Adrian Matika, and I'm going to be reading.
I wanted to skip a little bit forward just to show you what it ends up being, because this is another like assignment or project that you could have your students do.
As a soldier and as a war correspondent. It was also one of the very first poems I ever heard a poet read. As we all know, there's a great deal of difference between recitation and reading a poem on your own, especially when the person reciting it is Yusuf Komunyakaa. As soon as I heard him read, I knew whatever else might come, I needed to try to write poetry. The cry I bring down from the hills belongs to a girl still burning inside my head. At daybreak, she burns like a piece of paper. She burns like foxfire in a thigh-shaped valley.
Okay, so you can definitely, I recommend watching that whole video and also reading more poems by both of those poets. But I wanted to show you that too, because the kinds of venues for how the students present their creative writing don't just have to be on the page, right? Like you can have them do these other kinds of projects and presentations. And that can kind of hit different sort of goals that you have for your class as well.
My name is Adrian Matika, and I'm going to be reading You and I.
Sorry, a lot of like playing that video on accident. So I've been kind of like getting at a few possible assignments that you can use in your classroom. Here are some others. So for fiction, a character sketch is a good place to start for learning about character. If you go back to thinking about like character, plot, setting, theme. So to have your students write, you've maybe been reading and talking about character, their motivations, their flaws, what makes them complex or round versus a stereotype and flat. And then you have them write a character sketch. You can give them the parameters of this, what kinds of facts they need to have, how fleshed out it needs to be. But then they can trade it with someone who looks at their character sketch and thinks of like what is going to get in the way of that character. So if that character wants to go to Harvard, that's that's what their driving sort of like goal. and that maybe one of their flaws as a character is that they are, they think really well of themselves. Like they're not very humble. So you can have those kind of facts and give it to someone else and be like, well, who is going to get in their way? What kind of thing is going to get in their way? And make a list of possibilities. And that gets, it's fun because it's collaborative. You have a list of ideas. And it also starts to get them talking about, well, conflict and plot for your story. The switch a point of view, rewrite a well-known story from another character's perspective is super good, especially for younger students, because you don't have that burden of like creating a whole story. You're kind of working within the framework of a story, but you're just thinking about characters. So when I did it for 7th grade, we did it with the story of Cinderella. So a lot of them chose like the ugly stepsisters who they felt like had been wronged. Some of them chose like the animal characters. And that's a really nice one because it really helps you think about perspective and point of view. And it's also something where they want to champion characters that have been wronged. So it's kind of just like fun to see them take that on. Real life to fiction. So write a real life event up until the climax and then switch into anything can happen that you make up is a nice one because it works. You can work with real life details and think about setting. And then the last one is just a story proposal. So who's your character going to be? What is the conflict going to be? Where's the climax going to be? And then like, what is the theme? What is the idea that's present in the story? And I kind of structured these from most sort of guidance to least guidance to give you a sense of that range of like, I think you want to not give them nothing, right? You want to be like, just write a story. But you can have a range in terms of what they might be capable of at the level that you're teaching. Just some pieces of advice. For some reason, the students coming out of the elementary school where I taught, their teachers taught them not to use the word said, and that's a disaster. Please don't do that because then they're always just like every sentence is like some other weird vocabulary word and it just gets totally in the way. And that the other thing that I think is really useful is that they often, even I get this with undergraduates, that they think the word antagonist means like the bad guy or the villain. But often the antagonist is just whoever gets in the way or whatever gets in the way of the protagonist getting what they want. So it can be all kinds of different things. And if you have like good guy, bad guy, that really inhibits their ability to, I think, interpret literature that you're reading with them and also to write it. So those are just like two little shorthand pieces of advice. In poetry, something that's super fun is a sonnet Mad Lib. You take any kind of, if you're teaching Shakespeare, take any kind of sonnet, take out words in each line and just give the meter. So you can get great things like, my lover's eyes are nothing like the sun. McDonald's fries are nothing like the sun. You can create like all of these kind of funny things. They love it, but it also works really well to teach sort of their attention to the rhythm and the sound and the form. Another thing that I think is really successful for secondary ed students is erasure poetry. Some people call it blackout poetry. So you take a text that is not a poem and kind of find the poem within that, and then use a Sharpie or a whiteout pen to block out the rest of the text. And that's really fun too, to kind of like talk about how poetry and fiction as well is about finding the art in the everyday, or finding the art that's around you. An ekphrastic poem, which is a fun word, is just a poem that responds to a work of art. And that's another kind of great activity to get them thinking about visualization and description, as well as sort of a more subjective things that can go into art. So you can kind of make a combo assignment out of that. Poem beginning with a line from, and you can choose any lines, any poems that you want to give them just to get them going. And then lastly, the paint chip prompt, which is going to Lowe's or Home Depot, just grabbing a bunch of different colors for free. I've done this a bunch of times. No one ever frowns at you if you just take like 40 different colors and take them home. And then you can use that, have them pick a color that they respond to, list memories, list objects, list emotions associated with that color, and use it to write an image-based poem. And that's a nice place to start because it kind of like gets them opening doors in their mind that they might not otherwise sort of access when they're asked to write a poem. And it also starts them off in a really like visual descriptive space. And so my advice for the teaching poetry is to teach a mix of prompts or assignments, subject-based, form-based, and by form I mean what does it look like, what does it sound like, so rhyming or using a particular scheme, but don't make all of the assignments rhymed or all with formal constraints. So I wanted to give you some other sort of options for that, because some students are gonna love, like if you're like, it's gotta have this rhyme scheme, they're like, it's a puzzle, I love it. And some students are not gonna respond well to that, are like, these are too many rules, I don't like this, it's constrictive. And then you also have that problem where you get students that think like poetry can only be poetry if it rhymes, which is then something that later other teachers have to sort of like undo. So kind of get them to think more broadly about what a poem can be and what it can do. Is great for me when I get them as students, and it's also great for them because you kind of bring in all these different kinds of learners. All right. So that question of like, I don't know how to grade this, I don't know how to assess this, is a big one often. So here's a few comments just kind of about responding to student work. Keith said, they most likely don't have anyone in their life that takes their creative writing seriously. Be the person that does. Offer comments with excitement. If you have the space to, edit together rather than just grade, which I think is a really nice idea. Megan says, give feedback or facilitate the giving of feedback that is tailored to where they are in their development as writers. Some will be ready for constructive criticism and some are only ready for praise, but take their work seriously, make that praise specific, which I think is also really nice advice. And then Jacques, my friend Jacques, who taught middle school, says, treat them and talk to them like actual writers, not students of writing. So that's a nice place to start in terms of thinking about responding and comments, but here are some sort of nuts and bolts. And if any of you ever take my English 302 class, this will be familiar to you because I also use this method and have everyone use this method. And I recommend that you do take Introduction to Creative Writing, because then you won't have that like, no one ever told me what creative writing is and now I'm supposed to teach it. So just a little plug for that class. But the descriptive versus prescriptive feedback. Descriptive is offering your experience and understanding of the piece, and prescriptive is telling them what to do. And especially with creative writing versus something like essays, students, I think, really struggle with the idea of being told what to do in their artwork. So descriptive feedback allows you to let them still make their own choices. So the first step of that is to praise what's working well. And again, to go back to the idea of being specific, instead of saying, this is good, or I liked this, or you did a great job with this, you want to be as specific as you can. For instance, this character felt believable because, or this memorable, or this metaphor is memorable because, so they know kind of exactly what they're doing well and what's strong about it. Offer your experience of places that aren't working well. So for example, when I got to this scene, I couldn't see the setting. or I didn't understand what he was doing when he did this because I couldn't see what was going on. And that just gives your experience of the story, but it lets them know that, okay, in this moment, I can add that in. And instead of telling the author what to change, offer choices or opportunities and explain what those choices would do for the piece. So to use that example from bullet point number 3, you could say, really giving the details of the setting would help me understand why the character is so uncomfortable. Like, I didn't know it was snowing, or whatever it is that's going on in the story. Or so that you're not telling them to do something, but you're saying, if you did this, that would be the effect for me as a reader. So the feedback like this helps them think about, like, well, what is the audience experiencing and how can I control that in my writing? And in terms of, that was also about comments and feedback. In terms of assessment, you want to be really clear about the skills or concepts that will be assessed. So for instance, if you have a poetry unit, you can say, like, we're going to look for this assignment at similes and images, or character development and dialogue. So there are these kind of concrete aspects of the writing that you're telling them, like, I'm going to be looking at this for this assignment. And that allows you to use a rubric. So if you want to be really cut and dried about that, if that's like your teaching style and that's what you need, you can use a rubric to grade creative writing. You just need to identify the criteria for each skill. So like for fiction, if you're like, I'm going to grade you on your character development. So your character needs to have clear motivation. Your character needs to change from the beginning to the end of the story. Your character needs to have a flaw. These are kind of things where it's like, okay, I can go and check those off and make sure that my student is doing them. I feel like I have that sort of twice. So if you identify the skills or concepts, you can assess with a rubric that way and assign different point categories. I would steer very clear of grading based on your assessment of their talent or your assessment of their originality. I would save that for your written comments. You can praise their originality, but it shouldn't be a major rubric category because it is so subjective, and students can see that and they can argue with it. And students might be turned off from creative writing if they're like, well, I thought it was original and you're telling me it's not original, and I don't know how to address that as a student. So in your assessment, stick to sort of things that you can describe and quantify in terms of a rubric. And as depending on what age group you're working with, it might be something where you're really going more towards praise than criticism. As they get more advanced in their education, there's more that you can do, more complicated with in terms of giving them to work with in terms of revision. I think in my experience, students are excited about, like, most of them are excited about doing the creative writing unit. And that idea that, like, they're worried about their grades, or they're worried about doing it right, and that's the only reason they're doing it, that often will fall away as they get these other sort of ideas and they get their project going. So writing and inclusivity are kind of like they go hand in hand a little bit. I think one of the things that you get in it when you have a creative writing unit is a lot of trepidation because this is, like, it's not like math. You're sort of sharing a part of yourself, you're sharing a part of your imagination. And then you also will get, I don't think I have a bullet point here, but you'll get sometimes like things, poems or stories where you're like, maybe this is something I need to take to the counselor. You have, that's actually a big part of teaching creative writing. And it's, for me, it's something that always underlines the real need for it in the classroom, because for some students, like, this is like a really, really important outlet. And the only way that you're going to get to know them sort of as a whole person. So I just wanted to also, like, give that out as something to be aware of, is that you should take what happens on the page seriously. It's probably not all like made up and not serious. So, but a few other things that can really help create a safe space in your classroom is having the students share fears and hesitations anonymously. So if you're going to have a unit where they're going to be sharing their writing with each other or working collaboratively or doing peer review, to start out with like, submit like, what are you afraid of? What are you worried about in this unit? Anonymously, and then you can read it to everyone. So like, oh, everyone's afraid of like looking dumb, or everyone's afraid that someone else won't understand their writing or something like that. And that can kind of help build this awareness and sensitivity that you might want in your classroom. Using partners and small groups can help students feel comfortable sharing their work versus some kind of like reading in front of the class or like big class projects. Celebrating it. So to go back to that like video display of Adrian Matika reading, you can have students create venues to share and display their work. So if you wanted to have them make a book, make a website, make a video, all of these things kind of like serve to like be like, oh, your work is important and it should be shared in creative ways. Going around in a circle. Appropriation is something that, again, depending on the age of your student, you're going to address in different ways, but it's something that you definitely can talk about with your students at these stages. So to discuss like stereotypes, research, and imagination is useful. I think what I often have, like, I think the most common thing that I've seen in student writing that raises these issues for me is students writing about using characters that are a race that they're not, and homeless people. For some reason, students often want to bring in this like this homeless character and have them be very stereotypical. So that's something where you can talk about like, oh, well, we need a more complex character, or we need a reason like for this person to be the race that they are, and not just like have it be sort of random. So that's something that an issue that will come up that you will find when it happens, a way to talk to your students about it. And that's especially that place where, to go back to Keith's advice, if you're working one-on-one with them or editing together versus just
Can anyone else hear Professor Moffett, or is she frozen for all of you?
She's frozen.
Okay.
She's frozen, sir.
Yep.
I don't even see her video.
I'll send her a quick email.
It says her connection crashed.
We can't hear you.
hold on, let me send
Oh.
that. Oh,
Yep, you're back.
okay. That's so weird. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. Okay. I'm gonna go back to what I was saying. And hopefully that won't happen again. Let's see. And then this is like, okay. I only have a couple more slides. I was saying that some people don't get a chance to read contemporary work and both fiction and poetry in high school, and it's a really nice way to bring them into it. And one of the ways you can do that, if you have like a list of books and authors that you kind of are limited to, is to pair like a contemporary writer with a sort of canonical one. So if you read the Grapes of Wrath, that you can also read some shorter works or poems by migrant workers. And if you need those, if you can't find them, your librarian should be able to help you. So a nice thing to do is kind of like to make those pairings in your classroom. And then lastly, I just have compiled for you a few resources. Some of them I mentioned already. A nice kind of like compendium of PowerPoint presentations. Again, the Poetry Foundation has resources for educators and also for young people. Poets.org does a Poetry Out Loud, which is like a competition, but it also has a bunch of resources for teaching public speaking and writing. The Scholastic Art and Writing Awards are really cool. I had lots of students submit to those. So if you want to have that as like an end point, we're working on these things and we're going to submit them to this contest or extra credit for submitting them. That can be really fun for students and give them kind of a goal. And then How a Poem Happens is a nice sort of website that kind of gives the background of how each poem kind of got written from the perspective of the poet. So clearly a lot of those are poetry focused. I've given you some writing prompts, but there are like a million writing prompts that you can find on the internet. So I'm sure, perfectly able to do that for yourself. So you can also kind of like look through those and see what works for what you've been reading and what interests you. So that's the end of my presentation, but I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have thought of over the course of the last half an hour or so.
If I may, do you consider grading creative writing or grading poetry harder?
When you say creative writing, do you mean like fiction or do you mean like other kinds of writing?
Well, it can be either. I have very little creative writing background. I took a course in high school and I always thought it was very subjective.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's it's a lot easier for you as a teacher. So as someone who teaches creative writing, there's a risk of really just like spending way too much time grading creative writing, whereas you might like for an essay have a few things that you're checking off and you're like, all right, I got it. And as you go into the classroom and you're trying to manage your time, I think sticking with kind of the advice that I have about like, well, if you're feeling like it's really subjective, like make yourself a rubric that has the skills that you're looking for in each assignment. And you can use those kind of like 4 basic things, but like within a character, you can also kind of break it down to a little more granularly where you're like, I'm looking at the character development, like do they develop over the course of the story? Do you use dialogue correctly? Is your character round? So are they sort of like a stereotype? Are they like a bad guy? Or are they sort of a complex person that feels real? So you can kind of take these aspects and just make them as cut and dried as you want. And that helps you as a teacher kind of look and see like, well, am I assessing this fairly objectively? And it also helps as a student to see like, okay, it's not just about what does my teacher like me or not? Have I done these things? So that kind of really helps on both sides. Other questions?
So you plugged English 302 during your presentation, and I'd love to give you an opportunity to plug it some more. Actually, it looks like you may be frozen. Can you hear me, Professor Moffett?